Hello. Jeremy asked if I would speak on the work that I've been doing overseas for some years now, and also just touch on the theology of the poor. Obviously, within the time available, I cannot do justice to both of those things in full, but let's just begin by having a look at some of the things that I've been doing. I think it's helpful if I just gave you some background first of all. I've had a heart for the poor for many, many years, really, since childhood. And before I went into full-time Christian ministry, I in fact led a research team in a children's hospital, designing artificial limbs for physically handicapped children and working with other children with different disabilities. Then I joined Terry Virgo. Terry heads up a family of churches called New Frontiers, but at the time he invited me to join him, New Frontiers didn't exist. In fact, it's a church planting movement, and the very first church that he planted was out of my home. That was way back in the late 70s. New Frontiers now has some 1,000 churches in 70 or more nations. And in the year 2000, God spoke to me about becoming actively involved with the poor. I'd been serving Terry in a more administrative capacity for about 20 years at that stage, and I'd always had a heart for the poor, and as I travelled overseas on occasion with that administrative hat on, I would try and make it my business also to see what churches were doing with those who are poor and disadvantaged. And incidentally, I don't really like the expression the poor. I don't want to be called the short-sighted because I wear glasses. I want to be known as Nigel, with all the variety of characteristic and personality that brings. I happen to have to wear glasses. And I feel sometimes we're too willing to categorize people by their problem, like the disabled, rather than people who have a disability or people who are poor and disadvantaged. So although the poor is obviously a convenient shorthand, let's remember that they are actually people with just the same desires and wishes and longings and ambitions as you and I have. But they're people who often have had these taken away from them because of circumstances outside their control. Anyhow, I'm running ahead of myself a little bit. I started in about 2001, some 13 years ago, leading an initiative within the New Frontiers churches called Act Together. And for 5 years I led that initiative, which was essentially about helping churches, particularly in emerging nations, to engage with the poor people in their community and to bring ministry which was meaningful, which was empowering, which would release them to be all that God wanted them to be. And so I started traveling quite a lot, probably about 5 times a year for up to 2 weeks on each occasion, into many nations. I've been to Africa on quite a number of occasions now, 8 nations in particular I've worked with. I've been to India probably 20 times. I've also been to Mexico, to Russia, to Malaysia, to the Philippines. I've had the huge privilege of traveling widely and seeing cultures and social situations that no tourist will ever see. A huge privilege. And I love working with churches because churches are an integral part of community. NGOs and aid agencies and other development agents all do superb work within their areas of expertise. But the church is special because the church is integral to the community. The church is listening all the time to what people are really feeling, what the challenges are that they really face. And as they have problems, and the church maybe can help solve those problems, they're not going away. They're still with that person or with that family. And they're watching children grow up and can help again in other areas of challenge, whether it's education or health or getting employment. And so the church is a very special agent. And it's entirely with churches that I've been working. I'm not trained in development work. I'm actually trained professionally as an engineer. But having worked with children in a hospital and school, I do have some breadth of knowledge, not only in my discipline of engineering, but also being able to communicate with educators, communicate with medical profession, and so on. And I see my role as being a networker, as being someone who can help kind of capacity build or train people, to empower them. And at all times, I seek not to impose my will. It's very easy coming from a country like the UK or perhaps the USA to think you know it all. And this can be so offensive, very arrogant. We can come with a, I've got it, you need it, I'll give it to you sort of attitude. I wouldn't want people doing that to me. Why should I expect others to welcome me doing it to them? And so I like to get involved with them. The whole participatory learning approach that the IDS here teaches is very, very important, so that it's people who are making the decisions, the people who are experts at living within the context that they have survived in for generations. I don't know how to survive in their situation. They're the experts. So I'm there purely to facilitate them in maybe thinking through some ways to improve their situation and so on. Let me illustrate. Just 3 or 4 weeks ago, I returned from Guinea in West Africa. Guinea is a very, very poor nation. It is a nation that surrounds 180 degrees of Sierra Leone and then tucks down to Liberia. That's on the kind of coastal side, and then it also touches some inland and other nations like Guinea-Bissau and so on the outer boundary. I became involved in Guinea because of the civil war in Sierra Leone that took place during the 90s. I visited Sierra Leone quite a number of times during that phase. I would stay in bullet-filled homes, or in one case a bombed-out building with a UNHCR tarpaulin over the top. And I heard horrendous stories of what I can only describe as bestiality. And many of the Sierra Leoneans fled to the nearest place, and because Freetown and Conakry are both quite close to a common border there on the coast, many fled up into Conakry in Guinea, which is the capital. Now, Sierra Leone is English-speaking, Guinea is French-speaking. And because thousands of people went there, we planted a church there in the capital and also started a school. And so I have been visiting Guinea off and on for 12 or 15 years. Recently I went out there to see how things were going. It had been 3 years since I'd been there before, to help the church and to help a school. But let's first just have a look at some of the statistics of Guinea so that you can get a feel of what it's like to be there. The United Nations has a kind of poverty scale, and of the 187 nations on that scale, Guinea figures at number 178, very close to the bottom. Nearly half of the people live on less than $2 a day, in fact about $1.25 a day. The infant mortality is very high. Something like 140 per 1,000 children do not have a 5th birthday. Adult literacy is very low, only just over 20%. And of the adults who have been to school, the mean average that they have attended school is only 1.6 years. And so you have a nation that is very poor, very corrupt, and with people who are ill-equipped to do more than just survive. And in the midst of this, we planted a church and started this school, both with the intention of reaching out to help those who are the poor in their various communities. And the school I was visiting, which has been in existence now for about 8 years, we replanted it at one stage for various reasons, it has 320 children and a total budget for the whole year for all those children of £31,000. And yet, through the fees paid by the children, they cannot meet that budget. Less than £100 a year per child, less than a cup of cappuccino per week. And so it was into that very poor situation that I went to try and help them to explore how they could improve their situation. And with a tool that I've developed called a Ministry of Health Check, I spent 3 3-hour sessions with 10 of the teachers, and I facilitated discussion, and I helped them to evaluate how they were doing in various aspects of the school, not so much the formal teaching methods, but the underlying values, things like the vision, things like the place of the Christian gospel into the school, and so on. And having helped them to talk around these subjects and made careful notes, which I had on flip chart paper on the wall, we then developed an action plan to try and help them to work out how to improve the quality of education and the quality of life in that school. And by the time I left, they had an action plan with delegated responsibility and dates for fulfilling the initial action in any particular area. And I'll go on monitoring how they're doing, but all that we came to was because they had decided that's what they wanted to do. We also talked about starting a college, a school for teaching English as a foreign language. Guinea, as I say, is a francophone country, and they decided themselves before I got there that it would be good to start a college for teaching English. The school is an English medium school, but the government has recently said they want all people to be able to speak English. And so I helped them also develop a business plan, or start to develop a business plan. And I've asked them to go away and suggested that they should visit who are the competitors. Are there any forms of training of this sort that are already taking place? What is the competition from which they can decide how much they should charge, and so on. And since returning, I visited a college here in Brighton, the Olivet, which some of you may even know, which is owned by a member of CCK. And I've talked to them, and they are very sympathetic to helping in any way they can, with literature, with training perhaps. And so we can bridge the gap between a country such as our own and an emerging nation such as Guinea. Then last year I also went to a country called Burundi, a tiny landlocked country in Eastern Africa. Many of you will have heard of Rwanda, sadly, for the genocide that took place there in 1994, when it's thought that close on 1 million people were massacred in a matter of 12 weeks or so. It was an intertribal conflict. Now those two tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis, are the same tribes as there are in Burundi. And over a much more extended period, nearly 10 years, similar strife took place. And again, tens or hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Now Burundi, interestingly, is also 178 on the UN poverty scale. So the UN reckon that it's very much at the same level as Guinea. Now inevitably some of the circumstances differ, but overall the UN assessment is similar. There 80% plus live on less than $1.25 a day. That's an extreme level of poverty. Well over 100 children again per 1,000 die before their 5th birthday. The adult literacy rate is quite a lot higher than in Uganda, and the schooling, they've gone to school for nearly twice as long, but it's still only 2.7 years. Nothing compared to what we would expect as being a basic education. And so once again, a very poor nation. I was there because I've been introduced to a man called Everest through a very close friend of mine who used to work with me, Donna Bloomfield. Donna had been there as a principal of a Christian school in the capital, Bujumbura, in the late 90s while the Civil War was still raging. And she went back there about 4 years ago and met up with this man Everest, who had been administrator in the school, and in the intervening period he'd gone back to visit his village. Now, in many parts of Africa, the wealth of a family is measured by the number of cattle they own, typically the long-horned Ankole cattle. You'll see that animal on the left. Now, as he looked at his village that he had been brought up in, and where he still had some land, he started analysing why his village, along with so many in Burundi, were so poor. And he came to the conclusion, surprisingly, that these cattle were major contributors to the poverty. And the reason for that is that they actually don't produce very much milk, round about 1.5 litres a day. And they also roam the hillsides, and with them go the children. So the children then miss out on their education. They overgraze the land, so the land is then not very suitable for growing crops and food. And so they're actually bad news. They don't really contribute to a family's wealth. They drain it. And so Everest decided to be radical, and he introduced the Frisian cow, seen here on the right. Now, they have Frisians in neighbouring Tanzania, so he was able to import them from there, usually in calf, so that as they arrived, they already had another potential milk yielder, or if not, they could sell the bullock for meat. And they arrived, and he's now, in the last 5 years, got well over 100 families with these Frisian cows. At first they laughed at him. These cows don't have horns. But they realized then, when he started getting these cows producing 10 to 15 litres, 10 times as much per day, that maybe he was onto a good thing. And so he started what you might call a little cottage industry, where he gets the farmers to bring their yields, their milk, daily to collecting stations. There, they're carefully measured, as on the left in this picture. They're checked for quality to make sure that water's not been added. And they're then transported by the young men in the bottom left of that picture on their bicycles, believe it or not, to the nearest main road. The bicycle is purely a means of transport for the milk. They can't ride it, the ground is far too rough and mountainous. It's then driven down to Bujumbura, where the milk is heated up on charcoal so that it is pasteurized, and then it is sold through little kiosks or street vendors. And particularly it's sold into the slums, so that the children in the slums get good nutrition. And so he'd created a little business where he pays the farmer for the milk, or at least he doesn't pay them, but he runs off the loan that he's made to them to have their cow. So they then have the dignity, in 4 or 5 years' time, of having bought that cow themselves. They don't need 10 litres of milk per day for their family. They may need only 2 or 3. So they've always got surplus to sell. And so gradually he is empowering them to be able to earn money for themselves. The Frisian cows are kept in pens, so they no longer roam the hills, so the children can now go to school. And because they're generating some income as a family, they can pay the school fees and so on. So it's a win-win. You're creating employment, you are getting children back into education, you're caring better for the land because it's no longer overgrazed, and so on. And so through this initiative, which he believes is very clearly God-led, he has been able to see his way through to empowering these people themselves. They have the dignity of achieving it themselves rather than living on handouts. Well, now, what does the Bible say about poverty, about those who are poor? There's a very well-known theologian, John Stott, who died just 3 or 4 years ago, who was very much used of God over the last half century in the UK to rediscover the Word of God as an authority and rediscover evangelicalism. And he, in a book called Issues Facing Christians Today, projected that there were three sorts of people who were poor. There were the indigent poor, those who spend their lives just trying to survive, who have nothing, have no food, have no shelter, have inadequate clothing and so on. People who will spend the day looking for wood on which to cook whatever food they can find, who are looking to find shelter. People who are very much at the bottom of the pile in terms of self-sufficiency. And yet people whom God sees as having huge potential. And we'll come back to that. Then there are those who he would call the oppressed poor, those people who are poor because of circumstances outside themselves. Maybe it's street children. Maybe it's orphans because their parents have died of HIV/AIDS. Maybe it is people who have been unable to get any work, not because they are lazy, but that work just doesn't exist. Maybe it's people who have been abused by the authorities. Maybe it's people who have been the wrong end of a very corrupt government. So circumstances have got them in bondage. And these people, as with others who are deemed poor or disadvantaged, lack the ability to make decisions for themselves. They lack dignity. They need empowering. And then there's the third group, whom one would call the humble poor. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are humble, as it were, they will inherit the kingdom." The humble poor, those who just are vulnerable but open to receiving the gospel. And I guess that all of us, to some extent, would come into this category, or would have done so pre-conversion. And so John Stott talked about these in his book, and he gives good scriptural warrant for everything that he says. And as I was considering this, I thought, does Jesus hold the same sort of value? When we say, who are the poor, we're talking much more widely than those who are just economically poor. We are talking about people who are circumstantially or socially poor. And I was reminded, of course, that in Isaiah 61, often called the Kingdom Manifesto, or I would like to think of as Jesus' job description, you do in fact find him addressing these issues. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives. Those are captives to circumstances, they're not prisoners. He then goes on to say, and freedom to prisoners. To proclaim the favourable year of the Lord, and so on. And to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a spirit of fainting, so they will be called oaks of righteousness. So those who are poor in verse 1 eventually become like substantial trees. Let me illustrate one or two of the words in here. He talks about binding up the brokenhearted. The word used for binding up there, or the little phrase, is a bandaging word. And here you'll see a ministry I've been involved with in India, on the streets of Mumbai, where there is a clinic, a mobile clinic owned by one of the churches. And they go out every day of the week and they meet people with leprosy who have open wounds in their hands and feet. The nature of leprosy is it kills the nerves, so they do not know when they have a stone in their shoe or when they pick up a hot cooking pot. And the result is damage to their limbs. And so they're bandaged up by professional nurses working on a voluntary basis, and they are given medicine and creams and so on. And the bandage wraps the wound around and makes a little microclimate which is conducive to healing. And so when Jesus talks about binding up the brokenhearted, I think he's alluding to the church being there as a bandage, providing an environment in which people can be healed of emotional and other trauma. Then there is also, of course, it says about prisoners being set free. And there's a lovely ministry in Cape Town of a lady who started visiting the huge women's prison in that city. And as they came out of the prison, she would welcome them, she would take them to a safe house, she would take them on outings, she would teach them how to start generating income by some simple craft work like beads and so on. And also some of them became Christians. And so she broke the cycle where 80% of those women normally would be back in prison within 6 months. This is setting the prisoners free. And we end up in this passage, which could take a lot more exposition, by finding that those people who were poor in verse 1 become oaks of righteousness. And as I finish, let me just introduce you to some friends. In the top left there, 5 men I first met in about 1998. And when I went back a few years later, I found that they had moved from their 1998 role, acting as houseboys, as they call them in Zimbabwe, men who just came in and did housework for rich people. And because of the church, they were all now either church leaders or running their own businesses. Bottom left, a man called Justice on the border of Lesotho and South Africa. He is actually a Basotho. And he had been brought up in a very cruel environment where a South African farmer would beat his father and beat the children. And they returned over the border into Lesotho because they preferred the poverty of Lesotho to the way they were being treated in South Africa. Then they found the Lord and have now become not only church planters, but actually they almost have an apostolic oversight role to a number of churches in that area. Top right, a former drug addict who, when he was saved and came off drugs, started a drug rehabilitation center in Russia. And Volodya now provides more church planters to the local group of churches in that area than any other source. He is constantly bringing people out of drug addiction into the good of the gospel, and is able to send them out to plant churches and to help bring other people to faith in Christ. Now, as I say, in this short time, it's not possible to deal fully with the theology of the poor, but I've tried to touch on it through John Stott's work and then by illustration. But I do want to commend a book called Embracing the Poor. I was involved in writing this together with half a dozen other people internationally, and we were seeking to put into people's hands a very accessible and practical theology of the poor.